Hello everyone, Jay Warden here, and welcome to my recap and review of the episode Lonely Among Us, which is certainly not doing Season 1 of TNG any favours. Remember, spoilers are ahead, otherwise do try to enjoy this mess of an episode. The Enterprise is picking up some delegates from a star system with two inhabited worlds, the Antigons and the Sele. Both worlds want to join the Federation, but are apparently mortal enemies of each other, highlighting just how idiotic the Federation seems to be sometimes when considering who it wants to admit into the club. As they leave the system, Data picks up a strange energy cloud in their path, so Picard orders a close pass on it so they can gather some more info. As they get closer, the cloud expands and Picard just lets the Enterprise drive right through it, seemingly unconcerned about the safety of his ship. Meanwhile, LaForge and Worf are doing some maintenance on the sensors, with Worf commenting on just how much he loves his work before getting zapped by some strange blue energy and gets knocked unconscious. As Dr. Beverly arrives to help, Worf suddenly freaks out and has to be restrained before being sedated. In sickbay, Dr. Beverly is examining Worf when the blue lightning that struck Worf earlier starts zapping her. She seems disorientated and confused, and then Troy comes in wondering if she's okay when Worf wakes up wondering why he's lying in sickbay. Troy says she best let Dr. Beverly explain, but instead she walks out without saying a word. As the Enterprise moves away from the cloud, Data is explaining that we learnt fuck all about the energy cloud and it might be worth investigating it further, but Picard says that although he loves a good mystery, they have to get their annoying squabbling delegates to their conference, so orders LaForge to resume course. Dr. Beverly arrives home to her quarters and Wesley prattles on about dilithium crystals and is surprised when she takes a keen interest in what he has to say. But she seems distracted still and is actually more interested in helm control. Wesley explains that what he's doing has nothing to do with that, so she gets bored and walks out, leaving Wesley confused. She then goes to the bridge and looks wantonly at the helm before Picard asks her for a report on Worf's condition. She gives a brief unhelpful answer before moving off, continuing to look somewhat distracted. Picard seems to note her odd behaviour, but instead of checking up to see if she's okay, simply walks away unconcerned. At the science station, Data wonders what helm control has to do with her medical checks, but she ignores him, so he just shrugs and goes back to what he was doing. Suddenly the blue lightning transfers from her into the science station and she snaps back in shock. She looks very confused and wonders why she's on the bridge. Data and Picard ask if she's okay, but instead of explaining that she has no idea why she's on the bridge or what's going on, simply walks off and says she'll do her work in sickbay, making me wonder why no one seems to really give a fuck about her odd behaviour. Suddenly, various systems start failing from warp drive to transporters, so Picard calls a meeting and demands to know what's going on. Because Chief Engineer Argyle can't be bothered to turn up in this episode, he sends his assistant Lieutenant Singh up to explain instead. He says although everything is working now, he's not really sure why they failed in the first place. Picard though isn't satisfied by this answer and demands further investigations. We get some more bullshit with the Antigons apparently wandering around the ship with weapons near the Sele before Worf reports that the warp drive is failing. Picard is unhappy that his relatively brand new ship keeps breaking down, so calls yet another conference to demand answers. Data and Riker suggest sabotage and they can't believe it could be a member of the crew, so they immediately suspect the squabbling delegates instead. Excuse me, does no one remember the big fuck off energy cloud the ship passed through? Is everyone just taking the stupid pill today? In engineering, Wesley is assisting Lieutenant Singh with the warp drive repairs, but he tells Wesley it's time to go to school. So Wesley leaves and Singh continues to work on his own because apparently as well as having absent chief engineers, they also have no regular staff either. As he looks at his console, he gets zapped by the blue lightning and gets violently thrown to the floor. Worf arrives conveniently seconds later and checks up on him, only to find that he's dead and reports in to Picard. Later, Worf, LaForge and Wesley are checking up on the engines and they're now magically working. LaForge just assumes Singh had managed to fix them before he got killed, but Wesley disagrees, but because he's just a boy, they ignore him and report to Picard all is well and they can go back to warp. As Yar interrogates the delegates where they were during Singh's death, Worf joins Dr. Beverly and Troy in sickbay to talk to him about his earlier blackout, to which he replies he doesn't remember having a blackout. Sorry, I just found that line funny. Dr. Beverly explains that she had a memory blackout too, so instead of using all her medical technology and knowledge first to see if there are any problems or explanations, immediately turns to Troy to use hypnosis to find out what happened. She puts them under with a hilarious looking device of blinking lights and they both explain how they feel another presence in their minds. Meanwhile in the conference room, Data has literally turned into Sherlock Holmes and is amusing everyone with his deductions. He reaches to the conclusion, dear viewer, that it can't possibly have been the delegates who sabotaged the ship because they're too focused on killing each other, leaving the conclusion that there's something else aboard the ship, because you're all too stupid to have figured this out 10 minutes ago. So, Sherlock, Troy and Dr. Beverly have a meeting with Picard and explain their conclusions that something else is afoot when suddenly helm control once again fails. Picard goes to take a look at the helm when he's suddenly zapped by the blue lightning. He then asks why the helm isn't working and LaForge tries to explain, but Picard says, no, you're wrong and you should check again. LaForge checks and to his surprise everything is now working okay. He then orders a course change, leaving everyone confused because Picard seems to be behaving rather oddly, so Riker wants to know why they've changed course. Picard says he thinks the energy cloud will give them an important discovery, and Troy wants him to share his reasoning, but Picard just says, I don't need to explain my orders to you and that you should just obey me. Whilst O'Brien gets a cameo in this episode by chasing down the fucking annoying delegates who still want to murder each other, the crew meet in private to discuss Picard's odd behaviour. Troy says she feels he's closed himself off and has become dangerous, but Riker thinks there's no justification to relieve him of command simply because he ordered a course change, and that he hasn't been showing any overt unusual behaviour. Wait, sorry, have you been watching the same episode as me? Because I'm clearly seeing some overt unusual behaviour. Dr. Beverly says she'd need to examine him to determine if something was wrong before she could support relieving him, so they agree to try and persuade Picard to get looked at. Riker and Dr. Beverly then go to Picard's office and ask him very nicely if he'd consent to get looked at, and he wants to know why. Riker, doing his best to tread on every eggshell he can, admits that he thinks he's not himself and that they just want to check him out to be sure. Picard though says it's actually them who are acting weird and they should get themselves checked out, and says if they don't, he'll force security to do it for them. Later though, Dr. Beverly comes back and hands Picard the report, and he simply doesn't give a shit, so she presses further and asks if he's really still Picard. He turns to look at her and suddenly has added some reverb to his voice and admits that yes, Picard's there somewhere, but an entity inside him is now in charge. She's a bit freaked out by this, but he says it'll all be fine and just wishes she could understand. As the Enterprise arrives back at the energy cloud, Picard makes an announcement that, as no one at all suspected, they did in fact pick up a hitchhiker from the energy cloud, and goes on to make a rambling speech before expressing regret at the death of Singh. Troy and Riker want to know if the real Picard is still in there somewhere, and the entity tries to explain that they've essentially merged now and a new adventure awaits them by being pure energy and exploring the galaxy in this form. Riker demands to speak to him in private, but Picard continues to ramble, and Troy realises he's planning to beam out into space so they can exist together as pure energy, and announces his resignation from Starfleet. Dr. Beverly finally finds some balls and tries to relieve Picard of duty, but just as Riker tries to order security to the bridge, Picard turns into Emperor Palpatine and starts throwing force lightning everywhere, incapacitating everyone on the bridge. Using the distraction, Picard makes his way down to the transporter room and beams himself into space. What? I don't understand. Wait, can you explain? What? With the episode now in batshit insane mode, the crew is still trying to locate Picard's energy pattern an hour later, and are about to give up when Troy suddenly picks something up and says he's still out there and in distress. Data speculates that if the ship moves through the cloud again, it will give him an opportunity to get back inside the ship somehow, so Riker makes it so. As they move through, Worf's station starts going crazy, and Troy feels something is with them, because apparently her sensors only work when the plot needs them to. Then the helm starts going crazy and a P forms on his screen, which means it must be Picard. Data then says he has an idea, so goes down to the transporter room, retrieves the captain's physical pattern and hopes his energy will know to combine with the transporter. Luckily for him it works, and he's able to reassemble Picard and beam him back whole. I'm sorry, this is just so ridiculous. Picard doesn't remember how he got there, and Data says that obviously he has no memory because his physical pattern is from before he beamed out, because of course that makes just about as much sense as the rest of this fucking episode. He seems confused but just shrugs it off and prepares to go about his business as if the last few minutes of insanity never happened. Riker says Dr. Beverly wants to see him in sickbay first because he looks a little tired, but before he can go anywhere, Yar comes in and informs him that one of the Sele delegates is missing and that they found his body about to be cooked and eaten by the Antigons. Picard says that after all that's happened he does feel a bit tired, so tells Riker to deal with it. Troy smirks and we all have a good light-hearted moment about the brutal murder of a diplomatic envoy. Wow, what an utterly incoherent mess of an episode, and those last 10 minutes it just goes completely off the rails. My notes for this episode are just a lot of questions asking why. It doesn't beat Code of Honor for worst episode ever because amongst the mess is a couple of elements I actually liked and enjoyed, and towards the end it started entering the so bad it's good territory of just how insane it was because I was actually laughing at the stupidity of it. So let's get the side plot out of the way first, and I'll be brief. It's utterly pointless and lends no value to the episode whatsoever. There's no meaningful message or actual relevance to the main plot, beyond giving the Enterprise a reason to be getting somewhere urgently so they can encounter the energy cloud. The makeup of both species is awful, though I will give them a little credit for at least trying to make some genuine looking aliens, but the attempt is about as convincing as a classic Doctor Who alien. Also, given how much they obviously want to murder each other, why weren't their security teams stationed outside their quarters the whole time? And why was the Federation even considering their applications to join when they're this violent? Did no one do any preliminary research on these species? Perhaps the most egregious thing here is the way the episode makes light at the end when apparently one of the delegates is murdered and about to be eaten, with it just pretty much being treated as a joke. Yeah, very professional, guys. But enough about that distraction, let's move on to the main plot, if you could call it that. As I said, it's a mess, and pretty much relies on everyone being stupid for it to advance to where it eventually ends up. As I mentioned earlier, my notes are just a long series of questions, and I think it's just easier for me to sum up this episode's incoherence and stupidity by just listing them. So, why doesn't Picard at least try to avoid being caught in the energy cloud? Why is no one bothered by Crusher's strange behaviour? Why do the crew assume someone on board is sabotaging the ship instead of looking at the energy cloud as the culprit for their system problems? Why is the chief engineer not at this important meeting to report on these serious problems? Why is Lieutenant Singh all on his own in engineering? Why do Worf and Geordi ignore Wesley's warning that Singh couldn't have fixed the warp drive? Perform thorough medical scans and tests to find out what happened? Why is Picard left unchallenged for so long once he's been taken over by the entity when it's fucking obvious? Why doesn't Troy immediately recognise this when she earlier said she sensed a strange duality? Why does Picard's voice turn echoey once the entity reveals itself to Crusher? Does the entity just like to be dramatic? Why did the entity hide its presence whenever it's in control of someone, but then later on says it tried to communicate with him and just wanted to go home? Why does the entity even need Picard to go with it in the first place? Why would it assume that that's even possible? Why would Picard want to go along with it? Where did his sense of duty to his ship and crew go? How does Picard survive his energy out in the cloud for over an hour? Picard know how to manipulate the computer to make a nice little pee? Picard know to get back into the ship? How does the energy know to go into the physical pattern? Why doesn't he remember it afterwards if that was his consciousness? How do they have his physical pattern stored in the transporter? And why does Picard appear to generally not give a fuck at the end about what just happened? Unfortunately, most of the answers to these questions are simply because the plot needed to happen and lazy writing. The last 10 minutes are just utterly ridiculous, with Picard beaming out into space as energy for over an hour before the crew managed to get him back, and to what point and purpose? Picard doesn't learn anything from the experience, and neither do we, and our suspension of disbelief is long since gone. He was completely out of character at the end, seemingly not interested in following up just what happened to him beyond a quick question, no apparent concern for the well-being of the ship and his crew, and his utter indifference to the murder of the Sele delegate, pretty much just making a joke out of it and leaving it to Riker to deal with. Riker also somehow lost his balls in this episode, with both him and Crusher just too scared to do anything to challenge Picard, even though it's fucking obvious he's been affected by this entity. It seems to me that he would have had ample justification to simply relieve him of command and accept the consequences if he was wrong. Instead, when they do challenge him about his behaviour, Picard's response is basically, "No, perhaps you are the ones under the influence," and they just say, "Yes sir," and leave. I mean, I could go on with this, but there's no answers, and it would just be me ranting about all the things that don't make sense in this episode. So, let me just move on to a couple of things that I did actually like amongst this huge mess. This is the first episode which establishes Data's interest in Sherlock Holmes, and it's great fun, just watching him taking on the persona and smoking the pipe in the meetings, with Riker also clearly enjoying it as well. Brent Spiner has really good comic timing, and that really shows in these scenes, and yeah, it's good fun, I love it. Worf actually gets a tiny bit of development too when he and LaForge are in the census room chatting about their work. It's probably the first time we really get a hint of Worf's total dedication to his duty, something that will become a big theme for him as he gets more focus as a character in future seasons. We also see some consistency with Wesley as he starts to begin his studies as an acting ensign, once again not being really that annoying and just generally doing his job. There's also a nice establishing shot earlier on where the camera reverses in on the ship before cutting to the conference room and Picard's meeting. It's a neat trick, and it helps us define how the ship itself is laid out, as well as just showing how big the Enterprise really is. There's not really a lot more I can say about this episode without rehashing all my earlier questions, which basically have no answers, so I think I'll just leave it there. Next time we visit a planet of horny, peace-loving hippies who end up wanting to kill Wesley, putting Picard in a difficult position in the episode Justice. If you enjoyed this video, please do like, subscribe and share. This has been Jay Warden, signing off.